It was a day meant to celebrate family and togetherness. But the events of June 12, 2010, in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, revealed a dark and sinister reality. Beneath the facade of wealth and happiness, a wife's years of silence ended in an explosive confrontation that would shatter a family forever. What unfolded was a tale of betrayal, abuse, and justice that gripped a community and exposed the terrifying reality of domestic violence behind closed doors. The day was June 12, 2010, a day that would change everything for Grace Harrison. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the Harrison estate, a sprawling mansion perched on the outskirts of Atlanta. From the outside, it was the epitome of wealth and stability, a testament to David Harrison's success as a corporate lawyer. The air buzzed with preparations for the family reunion. Caterers hustled between the kitchen and the garden. Tables were adorned with fresh flowers, and the pool glistened in the early summer light. Guests were expected to arrive by noon, and everything had to be perfect. Grace Harrison had spent weeks planning this event, just as she had planned countless others. Her every move was calculated, driven by an unspoken pressure to present a flawless image of the Harrison family. She woke up early that day, her mind racing with a to-do list that seemed endless. As she dressed in a simple but elegant floral dress, her reflection in the mirror told a different story. Beneath the perfectly applied makeup were the faint traces of exhaustion and fear that no amount of powder could hide. Grace was 39 years old, a mother of two teenagers, Emily and Alex, who were the light of her life. She had given up her dreams of a career in interior design to support David's meteoric rise in the legal world. For years, she had believed in the dream they had built together, a loving family, financial security, and a bright future for their children. But the dream had soured. Behind the closed doors of their home, Grace lived a nightmare. David, at 42, was a man of contrasts. To the world, he was charming, generous, and successful. He was a frequent guest at charity galas, a sought-after speaker at legal conferences, and a beloved figure in their social circle. But at home, his true nature emerged. David was controlling, often exploding in fits of rage that left Grace walking on eggshells. The verbal assaults were frequent, but the physical abuse was sporadic, violent eruptions that would leave bruises she carefully hid from prying eyes. He wielded his wealth like a weapon, reminding Grace that she was nothing without him. Over time, the financial dependence, emotional manipulation, and fear for her children's safety kept her silent. The guests began to arrive at 11:30 a.m., their laughter and greetings filling the estate with an air of celebration. Grace moved through the crowd, a forced smile on her face, as she welcomed family members, friends, and David's business associates. She exchanged pleasantries with people she hadn't seen in years, her voice steady, but her hands trembling ever so slightly. Her mother, an observant woman in her 60s, noticed the subtle signs of distress. She pulled Grace aside at one point, asking quietly if everything was all right. Grace dismissed the concern with a shaky laugh, insisting she was just overwhelmed by the preparations. David, meanwhile, basked in the attention. He moved from group to group, his charm on full display as he recounted humorous anecdotes and discussed his latest courtroom victories. At one point, he gestured toward Grace, describing her as the backbone of the family. The crowd applauded, and Grace felt her stomach churn. She had heard these words before, empty phrases that masked the reality of their marriage. David thrived on appearances, and today was no different. The tension in the air became palpable around 2 p.m. when Grace noticed David slipping away from the main gathering. Curious and uneasy, she followed at a distance, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw him enter the guest house at the edge of the property, a small but luxurious space often used by visiting friends or relatives. Moments later, Samantha Boyd appeared. Grace froze, watching from behind the garden hedge as Samantha glanced around nervously before stepping inside. Samantha Boyd was 28 years old, an ambitious woman who had joined David's law firm as a junior associate 2 years earlier. She was strikingly attractive, with sharp features and a confident demeanor that masked her own insecurities. Samantha had grown up in a modest household and saw David as a mentor, and later as something more. Their affair had begun subtly, with late-night meetings under the guise of work and expensive dinners that David justified as networking. Over time, it escalated into something far more intimate. As Grace stood outside the guest house, the reality of their relationship became undeniable. She couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language spoke volumes. Samantha looked distressed, gesturing emphatically as if pleading with David. David, in contrast, seemed calm, almost smug, as he placed a hand on her shoulder. Grace's chest tightened. She knew David well enough to recognize the arrogance in his posture, the way he used his presence to dominate those around him. It was the same arrogance he had displayed during their arguments, the same smugness that often preceded his cruelest outbursts. Grace's mind raced. Over the past year, she had noticed subtle changes in David's behavior. He had become more secretive, spending longer hours at the office and making vague excuses for his absences. There were unexplained charges on their credit card statements, luxury items she never received, lavish dinners she hadn't attended, and even hotel stays she knew nothing about. But now, seeing the truth unfold before her eyes, the pieces clicked into place. At 2:30 p.m., Grace returned to the party, her movements robotic as she handed out glasses of champagne and listened to conversations she barely registered. Her mother approached her again, this time more insistent, but Grace brushed her off, unable to articulate the storm brewing inside her. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her discovery, and the knowledge that David's wealth and influence could crush her if she acted impulsively. David and Samantha rejoined the party around 3 p.m. Their demeanor casual, as if nothing had happened. But Grace couldn't unsee what she had witnessed. When David made a toast to family and the bonds that hold us together, Grace's hands clenched the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles white. The guests erupted into applause, but Grace felt only anger, fear, and a growing sense of resolve. As the afternoon wore on, David grew bolder. He stood closer to Samantha, his hand lingering on her back a moment too long. Grace noticed Samantha's discomfort, the way she avoided eye contact and nervously sipped her drink. By 4 p.m., Grace's composure was hanging by a thread. Her mind reeled with questions. How long had this been going on? How could David flaunt his affair so openly? And most importantly, how could she protect herself and her children from the fallout of what she now knew? Unbeknownst to the guests, the perfect facade of the Harrison family was beginning to crack. The reunion, meant to celebrate love and unity, had become a battleground of secrets, lies, and mounting tension. Grace, for the first time in years, felt the stirrings of defiance. She didn't yet know how or when, but she resolved that David's reign of terror would end. June 12, 2010, would not be just another day of survival. It would be the day she began to reclaim her life. The garden, sprawling with lush greenery and adorned with pristine white chairs, was now the center of attention. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting golden light over the Harrison estate, as David Harrison stood at the front, raising his glass. The guests, a mix of family, friends, and business associates, had gathered for what was intended to be a celebratory toast. The atmosphere buzzed with chatter and laughter, but behind the scenes, a storm had been brewing. Grace Harrison, standing near the back of the crowd, clutched a folder tightly to her chest. Her hands trembled, and her heart pounded so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. She had spent the past few hours in a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, fear, and a growing resolve to break free. Everything she had endured over the years had led to this moment. The realization of David's betrayal, coupled with the weight of his abuse, had become too much to bear. Grace felt the folder in her hands like a lifeline, a shield against the man who had controlled her for so long. As David began his toast, his voice carried with the same confidence and charm that had always masked his darker nature. He spoke of family, love, and the strength of their bond. The guests smiled and nodded, oblivious to the hypocrisy dripping from his every word. Grace could see the way Samantha Boyd, seated near the front, avoided eye contact with her. Samantha shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her face pale despite the warm evening air. Grace's resolve hardened. She could no longer let David's lies define her life. With every ounce of courage she could muster, she stepped forward. At first, her voice was weak, barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. But as she began to speak, a hush fell over the gathering. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Grace didn't look at David as she spoke. She couldn't bear to. Instead, she focused on the crowd, the very people who had admired David for his success and charm. She recounted the years of pain she had endured, the verbal lashings, the threats, the nights spent covering bruises and hiding her tears from Emily and Alex. The words came pouring out, raw and unfiltered, as if years of silence had burst a dam inside her. The guests were stunned, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and sympathy. As she continued, Grace opened the folder and held up the evidence she had spent hours collecting. There were bank statements detailing extravagant purchases David had made for Samantha, jewelry, luxury trips, and even the lease for a high-end apartment in the city. Grace's hands shook as she showed them the proof of his infidelity, the undeniable betrayal that had shattered whatever remained of their marriage. The crowd gasped audibly when Grace turned and pointed toward Samantha. The young woman, who had been trying to sink into her seat unnoticed, froze. Her face turned red, and she fumbled with her purse, as if searching for an escape. A few guests whispered furiously among themselves, their once respectful glances at Samantha now tinged with judgment and anger. One of David's cousins, a fiery woman who had always been protective of Grace, stepped forward, blocking Samantha's path as she tried to slip away. Others joined in, their voices rising as they demanded answers. The tension escalated when David, whose initial reaction had been one of stunned silence, snapped into action. He strode toward Grace with a fury she had seen many times before, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Grace felt her heart seize as he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and punishing. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the weight of years of fear crashing down on her all at once. But then, something unexpected happened. Emily, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, rushed forward. Her teenage voice, filled with both fear and defiance, cut through the chaos. She stood between her parents, her small frame trembling but determined. Guests moved quickly to intervene, pulling David away from Grace and creating a barrier between him and the rest of the family. David's mask of control shattered as he yelled at the crowd, his attempts to regain dominance falling flat against the collective outrage. By 8 p.m., the party was over. The once bustling garden was now eerily quiet, save for the whispers of guests as they hurriedly gathered their belongings and left. Grace stood on the veranda with Emily and Alex by her side. Emily clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face as she tried to comfort her. Alex, though silent, stood close, his presence a quiet but powerful show of support. Grace felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that the truth was finally out, and terror at what David might do next. The next morning, June 13th, 2010, Grace made her way to the local police station. Her hands shook as she handed over photographs of bruises she had carefully documented over the years, medical records that corroborated her injuries, and a written statement detailing the abuse she had endured. The officers listened attentively, their expressions growing graver with each piece of evidence she presented. By the time she finished, there was no doubt in their minds that action needed to be taken. Later that day, David was arrested at his office. The sight of him being led away in handcuffs was both humiliating and shocking to his colleagues, many of whom had admired him as a brilliant lawyer and a family man. David's protests were loud and indignant, but they fell on deaf ears. The carefully constructed image he had spent years cultivating was beginning to crumble. By June 15th, 2010, Grace had filed for divorce. Her case became the talk of the town, with local newspapers covering the story extensively. David's wealth and influence, once a source of intimidation, were now a double-edged sword. His financial records were scrutinized, revealing not only his infidelity, but also his attempts to hide assets and manipulate Grace's access to their shared accounts. The fallout extended beyond the family. On June 20th, 2010, Samantha resigned from the law firm. The public scrutiny and harassment she faced were unbearable. She released a carefully worded statement claiming she had no knowledge of David's abusive behavior, but the evidence told a different story. Text messages between her and David revealed that she had been aware of Grace's suffering, but had chosen to look the other way. The once perfect image of the Harrison family was now irreparably shattered. Grace, though shaken, felt the stirrings of hope for the first time in years. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to take control of her life, one step at a time. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as the trial began on July 10th, 2010. Grace Harrison sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a simple black dress, her face pale but resolute. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment she would stand up to the man who had terrorized her for years. Sitting a few feet away was David Harrison, his face stoic, but his jaw set in the rigid defiance of a man who refused to accept his downfall. His expensive suit and carefully groomed appearance seemed out of place in a setting where his darkest secrets were about to be laid bare. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, family members, and curious onlookers filled every seat. The story of the wealthy lawyer-turned-abuser had captivated the public, not just because of David's high status, but because of Grace's courage in exposing the truth. For many, Grace was a symbol of resilience. But for her, this trial was about more than justice. It was about reclaiming her life and ensuring the safety of her children. The prosecution began by painting a vivid picture of the life Grace had endured. Her testimony was raw and powerful, a steady stream of memories that left the courtroom in stunned silence. She described the years of fear, the nights spent trembling in locked bathrooms, and the constant threat that David's temper posed to her and their children. Each word carried the weight of suppressed pain, and at times Grace's voice faltered as tears filled her eyes. But she pushed through, determined to make every detail count. The evidence was damning. Photographs of bruises and medical records documenting her injuries were displayed for the court. There were detailed bank statements showing David's extravagant spending on Samantha Boyd, evidence of financial manipulation that left Grace with no access to their wealth. The prosecution also introduced text messages David had sent Grace, filled with threats and demeaning language, starkly exposing his cruelty. Witnesses were called to the stand. Neighbors recounted overhearing loud arguments and even witnessing bruises on Grace's arms and face. One neighbor, a retired teacher, described an incident where she saw Grace sitting in her car, crying, afraid to go back inside the house. The housekeeper, who had worked for the Harrisons for years, confirmed seeing broken furniture and overhearing violent altercations. She also revealed how David had once threatened her job if she ever spoke about what she had seen. David's defense team was relentless. They attempted to paint Grace as emotionally unstable, suggesting that she exaggerated her experiences to gain sympathy and financial leverage in the divorce. They pointed to her lack of a formal career as a sign of dependency, insinuating that her accusations were born from bitterness and greed. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The photographs, the messages, and the testimonies left little room for doubt. Throughout the trial, David maintained a cold, detached demeanor. He rarely looked at Grace, his focus instead fixed on his defense team. He spoke only when necessary, his words calculated and devoid of emotion. He refused to acknowledge the pain he had caused, portraying himself as the victim of a vindictive wife. But as the trial progressed, the cracks in his facade became evident. The moments when the prosecution presented undeniable evidence, such as the bank records or his threatening messages, were met with slight twitches of his jaw, a sign that he was losing control. The turning point came during the testimony of Emily Harrison. At 16 years old, Emily stood on the witness stand, her voice trembling but steady. She spoke about the nights she and her younger brother, Alex, would hide in their rooms, listening to their parents argue. She described the fear she felt seeing her mother bruised and crying, and the helplessness of being too young to intervene. Her testimony was heartbreaking and left the courtroom in silence. It was clear to everyone that the impact of David's actions extended far beyond Grace. It had scarred the children as well. By July 25, 2010, the trial had come to a close. The jury deliberated for hours, but for Grace, it felt like an eternity. When the jury returned, their verdict was unanimous. David Harrison was guilty of domestic violence and financial fraud. The judge's sentence was swift and uncompromising: 5 years in prison and a substantial sum in damages to be paid to Grace. David's face, which had remained stoic throughout the trial, finally showed a flicker of emotion. A brief moment of disbelief followed by anger. For Grace, the verdict was bittersweet. While the justice system had held David accountable, the scars of his abuse would remain with her and her children. But it was also a moment of liberation. She had stood up to the man who had controlled and terrorized her, and she had won. As she left the courtroom, holding Emily and Alex's hands, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt free. In the weeks that followed, Grace began to rebuild her life. The court granted her full custody of the children and ownership of the family home. She used the damages awarded to her to start a foundation for domestic abuse survivors. The foundation, which she named Grace's Haven, became a sanctuary for women who, like her, had suffered in silence. Through her story, she empowered others to speak out, offering them hope and resources to escape abusive situations. The trial and its aftermath left a deep impact on everyone involved. David, now a disgraced lawyer, began his prison sentence, his once pristine reputation in ruins. Samantha Boyd faded from public view, her career and social standing destroyed by her involvement in the scandal. But for Grace, the future was finally bright. Though the journey had been harrowing, she had emerged stronger, determined to build a better life for herself and her children. This is a very exciting case, and we have a similar case to this. The case where a wife exposed her husband's affair with her boss at a family reunion, and it ends deadly.